By 1235, the foundations of an empire whose future rulers would amass and control more gold than medieval Europe ever knew existed, stretching across territory larger than Western Europe, and establishing trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world, would be laid. But tonight, you're experiencing how it all began, not with grand battles or political maneuvering, but with a disabled boy learning to walk, a family feud that goes spectacularly wrong, and years of exile that feel less like heroic preparation and more like an extended camping trip nobody wanted to take. The transformation from crippled prince to emperor of the medieval world's wealthiest state is about to become very, very personal. But before you get really comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you are enjoying what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you over there. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the dusty courtyard of Niani when the hunters arrive, and honestly, they look like they've been traveling for weeks without discovering soap. The lead hunter dismounts with the kind of theatrical flourish that suggests he's about to deliver news that will change everything, which in medieval West Africa usually means someone's about to get married, divorced, or executed. Behind him, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, sits a woman whose physical appearance could charitably be described as unconventional. This is Sogolon, and according to the hunters, she's carrying the future of the Mandinka people in her destiny. The irony is immediate and unavoidable. King Magan receives this prophecy with the kind of diplomatic enthusiasm reserved for gifts you can't return. The hunters explain that this particular woman will bear a son who will become the greatest ruler in West African history, which sounds impressive until you actually look at Sogolon, who appears to have been constructed by someone who'd heard about women but never actually seen one. She's hunchbacked, weathered, and possesses the kind of face that makes people suddenly remember urgent appointments elsewhere. The assembled court maintains the kind of respectful silence that actually screams skepticism. You watch the king's other wives exchange glances that could freeze water. They've spent years perfecting the art of palace politics, producing healthy sons and daughters, maintaining their figures, and generally behaving like the kind of women who might plausibly mother future emperors. Now they're being told that this woman, who looks like she's been personally cursed by every beauty goddess in the pantheon, will somehow outrank them all through sheer prophetic destiny. The diplomatic smiles around the courtyard are so forced they're practically audible. The wedding ceremony proceeds with all the enthusiasm of a tax collection. King Magan marries Sogolon because you don't ignore hunter prophecies in 13th century Mali, but the celebration feels like everyone's attending a funeral for common sense. The other wives manage congratulations that sound like condolences, while court advisors develop sudden interests in their sandals. You can practically hear the collective internal monologue. This is the woman who's supposed to bear the Lion King. Really? This one? When Sogolon gives birth months later, the baby looks disappointingly normal. No lion's mane, no supernatural strength, no glowing eyes or prophetic birthmarks. Just a regular infant who seems blissfully unaware that he's supposed to revolutionize West African politics. The court's reaction is the diplomatic equivalent of checking your watch during someone's wedding speech. Polite interest masking profound doubt. Years pass, and the doubt transforms into something approaching panic. By age 3, Sundiata still crawls everywhere, while his half-brother Dankaran Tumen runs around the palace like he owns it, which, politically speaking, he increasingly does. The other wives stop pretending to hide their amusement. They start calling him the crawling prince, with a kind of fake sympathy that's actually weaponized pity. Sogolon's humiliation becomes daily entertainment. Court advisors begin suggesting alternative interpretations with the desperation of students who definitely didn't study for the exam. Maybe the prophecy was metaphorical? Perhaps great ruler meant spiritually significant rather than politically powerful. Could the hunters have misheard? These conversations happen in hushed tones because nobody wants to directly accuse professional hunters of fundamental incompetence, but the subtext is deafening. By age 7, You've witnessed what can only be described as the world's most public failure to launch. Sundiata still can't walk, let alone display any signs of destined greatness. Every attempt to get him on his feet becomes an exercise in collective embarrassment. Palace servants develop elaborate routes to avoid the courtyard where these training sessions occur. The king's patience wears thinner than his diplomatic smile. The prophecy that once seemed divinely ordained now feels like cosmic mockery. You're witnessing either the world's most delayed miracle or history's most expensive practical joke. The court operates under a constant cloud of second-hand embarrassment, watching a disabled child fail repeatedly to fulfill a destiny that's looking increasingly fictional with each passing day. What transforms this story from tragedy to legend isn't immediately obvious when you're standing ankle-deep in palace dust, watching a 7-year-old struggle with basic mobility, while his destiny ticks away like an hourglass filled with everyone's patience. The question hanging over everything like smoke from the cooking fires is simple. What makes a boy who can't walk the central figure in one of Africa's greatest epic tales? You're present on what can only be described as the morning everything goes sideways, though it starts like every other morning in the palace, with someone getting publicly humiliated before breakfast. Sundiata's stepmother, Sasuma, has decided that today is the perfect day to escalate her ongoing campaign of maternal warfare. She approaches Sogolon in the courtyard with that particular smile that medieval women perfected for delivering social death blows, the kind that looks friendly from a distance but cuts like a freshly sharpened blade up close. The weapon of choice is baobab leaves, which sounds harmless until you understand that fetching them is the kind of basic domestic task that any functioning household member should be able to handle. Sasuma announces, with theatrical concern that fools absolutely nobody, that she'd love to help Sogolon prepare the evening meal, but sadly, her own son has already gathered all the baobab leaves she needs. Perhaps Sogolon could send her boy to fetch some. The pause that follows is pregnant with malicious intent. Everyone present knows that Sundiata can't walk, let alone climb trees. The suggestion is less helpful offer than public execution. Sogolon's face goes through several interesting color changes as the full impact of this perfectly crafted insult settles in. You can practically see her dignity crumbling in real time as the assembled wives and servants absorb the implications. Her son, the supposed future king, can't even perform the most basic childhood errands. The laughter that follows isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. Sometimes the most devastating ridicule comes in whispers and barely concealed smirks. The humiliation sends Sogolon storming back to her quarters with the kind of maternal fury that suggests someone is about to receive the lecture of their lifetime. You follow, partly out of curiosity and partly because you sense that 7 years of accumulated frustration are about to reach their breaking point. When she bursts through the door, Sundiata is sitting on the floor, playing with some carved wooden figures, blissfully unaware that his existence has just become the day's entertainment. What happens next is the kind of mother-son conversation that therapists would have a field day with centuries later. Sogolon doesn't ease into the topic. She tells her 7-year-old son with the subtlety of a charging rhinoceros that she's tired of being humiliated because he can't walk. She's tired of the other wives' pity. She's tired of watching his half-brother run around like he owns the place while her son crawls. Most of all, she's tired of prophecies that sound increasingly like cosmic practical jokes. Sundiata's response is the kind of quiet determination that's either inspiring or terrifying, depending on your perspective. He crawls over to the iron rod that's been serving as his theoretical walking aid, a heavy piece of metalwork that's seen more use as furniture than medical equipment. The rod is substantial, the kind of iron implement that takes a grown man's strength to bend, assuming anyone would want to bend it in the first place. What happens next defies everything you thought you knew about physics and 7-year-old muscle development. Sundiata grabs the iron rod with both hands, and instead of using it to steady himself, he proceeds to bend it like it's made of warm clay. The metal doesn't just give way, it transforms into a perfect bow shape. curving under pressure that shouldn't be possible from someone who's never managed to support his own body weight. Then he uses this newly created bow-shaped support to pull himself upright, not gradually, not with obvious struggle, but with the fluid motion of someone who's been standing their entire life. His legs, weak for 7 years, suddenly support him like they've been waiting for exactly this moment. The transformation is so complete it's almost anticlimactic. Word spreads through the palace with the efficiency of a well-oiled gossip network. Within minutes, the courtyard fills with people who suddenly remember urgent business that requires them to walk past Sogolan's quarters. The same courtiers who spent the morning snickering about the crawling prince now whisper about supernatural strength and fulfilled prophecies. The speed with which public opinion shifts would be impressive if it weren't so predictably opportunistic. The iron rod, now permanently bow-shaped, becomes an instant artifact of transformation. People examine it like archaeologists studying evidence of divine intervention, which, from their perspective, might be exactly what they're doing. The physical evidence is undeniable. Metal doesn't bend like that without extraordinary force, and 7-year-olds don't typically possess extraordinary force. You realize you've witnessed something that will be retold for centuries, though probably with more dramatic music and better lighting than the actual event provided. The moment when someone literally rises from their lowest point carries weight that goes beyond the physical mechanics of standing up. Watching a boy who couldn't walk suddenly demonstrate the kind of strength that bends iron shifts your understanding of what's actually possible when someone finally decides they're finished being limitations defined to them. You're present for what unfolds after King Magan's death, watching palace politics transform from subtle maneuvering into something resembling a medieval corporate takeover, complete with hostile acquisition tactics and the kind of strategic backstabbing that would make modern executives take notes. Sasuma Berete, Sundiata's stepmother, doesn't waste time with a decent mourning period. The king's body is barely cold before she begins orchestrating her son Dankaran Tuman's rise to power with the efficiency of someone who's been planning this transition for years. The succession question becomes a deadly serious game between two camps, though calling it a game suggests both sides have equal chances of winning. Sasuma holds most of the political cards, the loyalty of key court officials, and the advantage of having a son who can walk without bending iron rods. Sundiata's supporters, meanwhile, consist mainly of people who believe in prophecies and his mother, which in medieval politics is roughly equivalent to bringing a strongly worded letter to a sword fight. Sasuma's approach to eliminating political competition makes modern election campaigns look like genteel tea parties. She doesn't just want her son on the throne, she wants Sundiata and his mother completely erased from the political equation, preferably in a way that doesn't technically qualify as murder but achieves similar results. The Queen Mother's influence in polygamous royal families was considerable, and Sasuma wields hers like a surgeon's knife, precise and devastating. You witness the subtle poisoning of court opinion, which happens so gradually you almost miss it. Conversations shift. Allies develop sudden amnesia about previous commitments. People who once nodded respectfully at Sundiata now find fascinating things to examine on the ground when he passes. The mysterious disappearance of his supporters follows a pattern that's too consistent to be coincidental. They don't vanish dramatically. They just stop appearing at court, stop speaking up during discussions, stop existing in ways that might help his cause. The growing sense that staying in Niani might be hazardous to everyone's health settles over Sundiata's remaining supporters like dust after a sandstorm. Palace servants develop the ability to become invisible when serving meals to his family. Guards forget to salute. The subtle mechanisms of royal respect simply evaporate, replaced by the kind of polite distance that suggests people are hedging their bets about who might be ordering executions next month. The final straw arrives, wrapped in public humiliation, because Sasuma understands that sometimes the most effective elimination doesn't require poison or assassins, just the complete destruction of someone's dignity. She arranges for Sundiata to be publicly ridiculed in a way that makes it clear her patience with potential rivals has officially expired. The message isn't subtle. Conform to irrelevance or prepare for consequences. that extend beyond social embarrassment. Sogalon makes the decision that will define the next decade of your life with the kind of maternal pragmatism that recognizes when strategic retreat becomes the only viable option. Exile immediately, before things progress from political marginalization to the kind of permanent solutions that medieval stepmothers occasionally employed. The choice isn't really a choice at all. It's survival wrapped in the illusion of dignity. You pack what you can carry, which in practice means whatever fits in traveling bundles that won't slow down a group moving quickly away from people who want them gone. Everyone assumes this will be a temporary retreat until the political climate improves, the kind of brief exile that allows tempers to cool and power structures to stabilize. The optimism is touching and completely unfounded. The journey begins with Sundiata, his mother, and a small group of loyal followers, none of whom realize they're embarking on what will become years of wandering across West Africa like refugees from their own family drama. The group includes people who sacrificed their comfortable positions in Niani for loyalty to a disabled prince whose main qualification for leadership is surviving his stepmother's political engineering. What started as family drama escalates into forced exile that feels less like strategic retreat and more like a desperate scramble to survive the aftermath of losing a political war they never really had a chance to win. The transformation from palace residents to wandering refugees happens faster than anyone expected, with a kind of brutal efficiency that characterizes most medieval power transitions. You begin to understand why experienced warriors and kings might eventually rally behind someone with no army, no kingdom, and a permanent reminder of childhood disability, because surviving the worst your own family can throw at you demonstrates a kind of resilience that can't be taught or faked. The years of exile that follow will test whether that resilience translates into the kind of leadership that builds empires. But first, you have to survive the immediate challenge of being homeless in a political landscape where your very existence threatens someone else's security. You're nearly a decade into wandering across West Africa, and your sandals have worn through twice while trudging from kingdom to kingdom across the savannah. The leather that once protected your feet now exists mainly as wishful thinking and strategic patches, held together by determination, and what might charitably be called thread. Under moonless skies, sleep becomes a negotiation between exhaustion and the kind of insomnia that comes from never knowing if tomorrow brings shelter or another day of walking toward uncertain hospitality. The romantic notion of exile, with its implications of noble suffering and character-building hardship, dissolves faster than salt in rainwater when confronted with the mundane reality of being perpetual houseguests who've overstayed their welcome everywhere. Each kingdom offers temporary shelter with the kind of hospitality that starts generous and gradually transforms into the diplomatic equivalent of checking your watch during someone's wedding speech. The initial warmth cools as weeks become months, and you can feel the growing awkwardness as your small group transforms from interesting visitors into a permanent burden that nobody quite knows how to politely eliminate. Your stomach has learned to rumble with gratitude whenever grains appear, while uncertainty about where the next meal comes from teaches you to appreciate optimism as a dietary supplement. Your body adapts to sleeping on different ground every few weeks, with the kind of reluctant flexibility that suggests your spine has given up expecting comfort and settled for functional adequacy. The heat beats down with relentless consistency, transforming every day into a negotiation between staying conscious and finding shade. Sundiata transforms during these years, though not through the dramatic revelations that storytellers prefer. His education comes through the slow grind of learning survival, diplomacy, and military strategy from pure necessity, the kind of practical knowledge that can't be taught in palace courtyards. Watching him absorb lessons from every kingdom you visit is like observing someone assemble a complex puzzle without knowing what the final picture should look like. He studies their military techniques with the intensity of someone who understands that theoretical knowledge might soon become survival information. The political structures of each kingdom receive his careful attention, and you watch him catalog their methods of maintaining loyalty like a scholar, documenting variations in legal procedure. Some kingdoms rule through fear, others through tradition, still others through the kind of charismatic leadership that makes people forget they have other options. Sundiata observes each approach with the analytical detachment of someone who suspects he might need to implement similar systems someday, assuming he survives long enough to have subjects who require governing. Oral tradition records that even the king of Memo was astonished by Sundiata's endurance. Watching this exiled prince adapt to circumstances that would have broken lesser men, the heat, the dust, and the endless negotiations for food and shelter become the backdrop against which a future emperor learns how to lead people who have every reason to abandon him. These aren't the heroic lessons of palace training grounds, where failure means embarrassment rather than starvation. This is education by attrition, where diplomatic mistakes result in sleeping under stars instead of roofs, and poor judgment means walking farther tomorrow to find kingdoms willing to tolerate your presence. Your skepticism about prophecies battles against growing evidence that this young man refuses to simply disappear despite having every excuse to give up. The physical hardships that break other people seem to strengthen his resolve, in ways that defy both logic and your increasingly cynical expectations. Each setback becomes information rather than defeat. Each humiliation transforms into insight about human nature and political necessity. He learns to read people's motivations through their hospitality, understanding which smiles mask calculation and which generosity comes with unstated expectations. The boy who once struggled to walk now covers distances that would challenge seasoned travelers, and somewhere in the process of learning to survive impossible circumstances, he's acquired the kind of quiet authority that makes people listen when he speaks, even when he has nothing obvious to offer them except shared hardship and uncertain futures. Years of uncertainty have reshaped both body and spirit, creating resilience that goes deeper than mere stubbornness. Then messengers arrive with news that makes your years of wandering suddenly feel like preparation rather than punishment. The news concerns Sumanguru, the sorcerer-king of Soso, who's making Sundiata's family problems look like a minor disagreement over dinner plans. The messenger who tracks you down is the kind of travel-worn individual who's clearly seen things that have permanently altered his worldview, and when he starts describing what's happening back home, you realize that stepmother drama was apparently just the opening act in a much darker production. While you've been trudging across the savannah, developing an intimate relationship with dust and questioning your life choices, Sumanguru has been systematically conquering and terrorizing the Mandinka homeland with methods that make ordinary warfare look like a polite disagreement between neighbors. This isn't the kind of conquest where armies meet in fields and the winner gets to redraw maps. This is deliberate, calculated brutality designed to break people's spirits before their bodies, which is considerably more efficient than traditional military approaches but significantly less pleasant for everyone involved. The reports describe Sumanguru's bone trophies, human skulls arranged as decorative elements in his palace, each one representing a ruler who failed to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for their new circumstances. These aren't swift military necessities but deliberate psychological theater, where the audience participation involves being terrified into submission. You wonder if such terror alone could keep all those kingdoms in line, until you realize it nearly did. Griot tales claim Sumanguru possesses magical powers that sound like someone took every supernatural horror story ever told and decided to implement them as actual policy. Immunity to weapons, the ability to disappear at will, supernatural strength that makes Sundiata's iron bending look like a parlor trick. Whether these abilities are genuine or just extremely effective, propaganda becomes less relevant when the practical result is the same. People believe he's invincible, which makes him functionally invincible until someone proves otherwise. The belief in magic and supernatural powers was deeply ingrained in 13th century Mandinka culture, influencing everything from daily decisions to military strategy. Sumanguru understands this cultural framework and exploits it with a kind of strategic brilliance that would be admirable if it weren't so thoroughly horrifying. He's turned psychological warfare into an art form, using people's existing beliefs as weapons more effective than cavalry or siege engines. The messengers who finally track down Sundiata in exile aren't making polite requests for assistance. They're begging, describing a homeland where people are afraid to speak above a whisper because even conversations might be interpreted as resistance. The Mandinka territories, including Niani, now exist under heavy tribute demands and the constant threat of execution for local rulers who fail to demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for their new circumstances. Freedom has become a theoretical concept, like unicorns or honest politicians. Sumanguru's rule has become so comprehensively oppressive that the same elders who once doubted a crippled boy's prophecy are now willing to bet everything on that same boy's return. This represents a remarkable shift in risk assessment. They've moved from skepticism about supernatural destiny to desperate hope that supernatural destiny might be their only remaining option. When practical solutions have been exhausted, impractical solutions start looking surprisingly reasonable. You witness the moment when Sundiata agrees to return, and suddenly years of wandering and learning transform from punishment into preparation. The skills he's acquired, the alliances he's observed, the diplomatic techniques he's absorbed, all of it takes on different meaning when viewed as training for confronting someone who's made tyranny into a science. The timing feels almost suspiciously convenient, except that convenience suggests planning, and nobody planned to spend years sleeping on different ground every night. The decision transforms your group from exiled refugees into the core of a resistance movement, though you're still not entirely sure how that's supposed to work, against someone who reportedly dissolves into smoke when attacked. Sumanguru's army is well organized and equipped with cavalry, archers, and foot soldiers trained to overwhelm opponents quickly, which provides some comfort since at least part of his military advantage operates within normal physical parameters. You realize that sometimes prophecies become believable not because they were always true, but because circumstances become so desperate that impossible solutions start looking reasonable. So how do you prepare to fight someone who might vanish when struck? Sundiata's next moves answer that question in brutal detail. The first step involves convincing other kingdoms to join a coalition led by someone who doesn't technically have a kingdom anymore, which is roughly equivalent to asking people to invest in a business plan written on the back of a napkin by someone living in their parents' basement. Sundiata travels court to court, waiting out polite offers of hospitality until rulers agree to risk war against a sorcerer whose main hobby involves collecting human skulls as home decor. Many wondered if an exiled cripple could lead troops against a sorcerer-king until they saw his iron-bending strength in person. The demonstrations become part of every diplomatic meeting, watching Sundiata casually bend metal objects while explaining military strategy tends to shift conversations from polite skepticism to serious negotiation. These meetings unfold in royal courtyards across West Africa, where you sit on uncomfortable stools watching rulers calculate whether joining this cause makes strategic sense or just guarantees they'll become Sumanguru's next decorative skull. Each meeting follows a predictable pattern that becomes wearisome after the 15th repetition. Sundiata arrives with his small entourage, receives the kind of hospitality reserved for potentially useful but currently inconvenient guests, and launches into his pitch about shared resistance and mutual benefit. The local rulers listen with diplomatic attention while clearly thinking about dinner plans or tax collection schedules, until the iron-bending demonstration transforms theoretical discussions into practical military planning. You witness the gradual process of forging a fighting alliance, watching as former rivals and neutral kingdoms slowly commit to a cause that seems impossible on paper. The process resembles watching someone assemble a puzzle, where half the pieces are missing and the other half come from different boxes entirely. Each potential ally brings their own concerns, their own territorial disputes, their own reasons for suspecting that joining military coalitions led by homeless princes might not represent sound political strategy. The transformation isn't magical. It's methodical, as Sundiata applies everything he learned during years of exile to the problem of military organization. You see him implement diplomatic techniques observed in kingdoms that offered temporary shelter, military strategies studied during long conversations with veteran warriors, and political insights absorbed through countless evenings spent listening to local rulers discuss their governance challenges. The education he received through wandering becomes practical application in alliance building. Key allies emerge from this diplomatic campaign, including Tabunwana, a general who defected from Sumanguru's forces with invaluable intelligence about Soso military tactics, and Tiramakan Traore, whose clan brought substantial military resources and regional influence. These aren't just symbolic additions. They provide the practical expertise and manpower that transform theoretical resistance into actual military capability. The administrative challenges of organizing a confederation involve solving problems that range from supply coordination to dispute resolution between allies who historically preferred fighting each other. Each kingdom that joins brings different fighting styles, different equipment standards, different expectations about command structure and battle tactics. The Mandinka clans, including the Traore, Kamara, Karoma, Konde, and Keita, each contribute fighting-age men who arrive with their own weapons and their own ideas about battlefield tactics. The military organization that emerges resembles something between a professional army and an armed neighborhood watch program run by committee. Warriors from northern territories arrive equipped with large reed or animal hide shields and stabbing spears called tambas, while southern fighters prefer bows and poisoned arrows. The variety of fighting styles and equipment creates coordination challenges that require constant negotiation between different military traditions. Gathering supplies means negotiating with traders who understand that desperate armies pay premium prices. Training fighters requires finding common ground between military traditions that developed independently across different kingdoms. Establishing communication networks across allied territories involves solving logistical puzzles that would challenge modern military planners, all while maintaining the diplomatic balance that keeps the coalition from fragmenting over territorial disputes or command authority. The process of watching someone fulfill a prophecy when you've spent years doubting it would ever happen becomes a slow recognition that competence and determination can look like destiny from the outside. Months of preparation culminate in the moment when this improvised confederation finally marches toward a confrontation that will determine whether all this diplomatic maneuvering and military organization was worth the effort, or if you've all just spent considerable time and resources preparing for spectacular failure. The confrontation arrives circa 1235 on the plains of Kirina, where two armies prepare for a battle that will determine whether prophecies actually mean anything, or if everyone's been dramatically overestimating the power of destiny. The morning air carries that particular tension that suggests someone's about to have a very bad day, though which army remains an open question. Your sandals have developed what could charitably be called character through months of marching, and your stomach has reached that philosophical acceptance that comes from understanding breakfast might be theoretical today. You realize that all the prophecies and political maneuvering come down to this single, brutal test of military strategy. It's the kind of moment that makes you appreciate why most people prefer their destiny delivered in smaller, more manageable portions rather than concentrated into one decisive morning, where everything either works or catastrophically doesn't. The weight of years of exile, alliance building, and strategic preparation crystallizes into the immediate question of whether Sundiata's coalition can actually function under pressure or will collapse like poorly constructed architecture. Sumanguru's forces are larger, more experienced, and led by someone whose reputation for invincibility has never been seriously challenged until now. His army spreads across the plain with a kind of organized intimidation that suggests they've done this before and enjoyed it. You count cavalry units, archer formations, and infantry blocks arranged with military precision that would be impressive if it weren't pointed directly at you. The Soso warriors carry themselves with the confidence of people who've won every previous argument through superior violence. You witness the build-up to combat, watching the positioning of archers who check their bowstrings with the kind of methodical attention that suggests they take professional pride in accurate projectile delivery. The nervous energy of warriors who've heard too many stories about their enemy's supernatural abilities creates an atmosphere where everyone checks their equipment twice and mutters prayers to deities they hope are paying attention today. The psychological weight of facing someone allegedly immune to conventional weapons adds an extra layer of complexity to what should be straightforward military engagement. Sundiata organizes his forces into a square formation with cavalry at the front and archers in the rear, a strategy that looks deceptively simple until you understand the coordination required to make it function under combat conditions. The Mandinka coalition includes warriors from multiple kingdoms, each bringing their own fighting styles and equipment preferences, which creates the kind of organizational challenge that tests whether months of preparation translate into battlefield effectiveness or expensive chaos. The battle itself unfolds not as a single dramatic moment, but as a series of tactical decisions, each one revealing how much Sundiata learned during his years of exile. You watch him respond to Sumanguru's cavalry charges with counter-movements that suggest he's absorbed every military lesson offered by kingdoms that provided temporary shelter. The theoretical knowledge gained through diplomatic conversations transforms into practical application under circumstances where mistakes have permanent consequences. The fighting develops into a clash of strategy and chaos, with neither side gaining obvious advantage until you notice the subtle shift in momentum that suggests experience might be overcoming reputation. Could such a small confederation really shatter Sumanguru's elite army? The answer unfolds in Sundiata's final move. Sumanguru's psychological advantage, built on years of successful intimidation, finally meets an opponent who refuses to be impressed by supernatural claims when faced with conventional military tactics. The spell of invincibility requires belief to function, and belief becomes difficult to maintain when your supposedly unstoppable forces encounter effective resistance. You're present for the moment when the tide turns, watching Sumanguru's forces discover that psychological warfare loses effectiveness when confronted by opponents who've survived worse than battlefield terror. The victory, when it comes, feels both inevitable and impossible, the result of superior strategy meeting years of preparation, but still carrying that quality of miraculous timing that makes observers wonder whether destiny might actually be a legitimate military tactic. Sumanguru's defeat shatters more than just his army. The psychological grip of fear that held the region in terror breaks like overstressed rope, and suddenly people remember that tyrants are mortal despite their marketing campaigns. The collapse of his forces creates a power vacuum that transforms the political landscape faster than anyone expected, opening possibilities for unified resistance that seemed impossible under his oppressive rule. The aftermath reveals the kind of swift disintegration that characterizes empires built primarily on intimidation. Sumanguru himself flees the battlefield, disappearing into the mountains with the kind of strategic retreat that suggests his confidence in supernatural protection has suffered recent damage. His remaining cities surrender with the enthusiasm of people who've been waiting for an excuse to stop being terrified. Standing on this battlefield, you've witnessed the exact moment when theoretical preparation transforms into practical empire building, though the full implications of what just happened won't become clear until you see what Sundiata builds from this victory. What emerges from Kirina is the foundation of something unprecedented in West African history. After his coronation in 1235, Sundiata's successors expanded the realm over the next century until the Mali Empire stretched across approximately 1.1 million square kilometers, encompassing territories that include modern-day Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and parts of 12 other nations. This empire established trade routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean, created centers of learning like Timbuktu that attracted scholars from across the known world, and influenced West African politics for centuries. Tonight you've seen the unglamorous truth behind empire building: grit, persistence, and willingness to make legends out of long-shot prophecies. The real foundation of legendary greatness turns out to be considerably less glamorous than the stories suggest: worn sandals, diplomatic exhaustion, and the kind of persistence that looks like destiny only when viewed from a comfortable distance. Remember, great empires often start with small, determined steps, sometimes on an iron rod bent by a single boy. What do you get when you take the most feared raiders in medieval Europe and ask them to protect the most sophisticated court? The Varangian Guard represents history's most unlikely career change. Vikings becoming imperial bodyguards. These Norse warriors went from pillaging churches to attending formal ceremonies, from sleeping in longships to navigating Byzantine palace intrigue. Tonight, we're uncovering how former enemies became the emperor's most trusted protectors, and why this cultural collision was as awkward as it sounds. Picture Emperor Basil II famously distrusting his native guards, so he began breakfast by checking his spoons, but double-checking which general wasn't plotting his assassination. This wasn't paranoia. This was basic job security in medieval Constantinople. The emperor's daily routine included administrative duties, ceremonial obligations, and wondering which of his military commanders were still plotting to kill him. Spoiler alert. They usually were. The Byzantine Empire had what you might call a trust problem. Every successful general became a potential usurper. Every promotion created a new threat. And every military victory made the emperor wonder if his commander might decide the purple robes looked better on him. Take Emperor Phocas, who seized power in 602 by murdering Emperor Maurice, then spent 8 years wondering which of his supporters might return the favor until Heraclius sailed from Africa and did exactly that in 610. The cycle continued with mathematical precision. Emperors rose through betrayal, ruled through paranoia, and fell through the same betrayal that brought them to power. It was medieval corporate ladder climbing, but with considerably more stabbing. The problem wasn't that Byzantine generals were uniquely treacherous. The problem was that they had every reason to be treacherous. Local commanders had family connections throughout the empire, political ambitions that stretched back generations, and extensive networks of allies who might benefit from a regime change. A successful general wasn't just a military asset. He was a walking conspiracy, waiting to happen, complete with his own political party, and probably a catchy slogan about restoring Roman glory. Local troops made the situation worse. They had wives in Constantinople, brothers serving in the administration, and cousins married to influential merchants. Their loyalty wasn't just to the emperor, it was divided among a dozen competing interests. When your bodyguard's nephew works for a rival political faction, you start wondering if your morning wine tastes slightly bitter for good reason. The Praetorian Guard had already provided a helpful historical lesson about what happens when you trust local elites with imperial security. They murdered so many emperors that, killed by the Praetorian Guard, became practically a cause of death category. Byzantine emperors looked at this track record and decided they needed bodyguards who weren't enrolled in the local political system from birth. Foreign mercenaries offered an appealing alternative. They had no Byzantine cousins to avenge, no local property disputes to settle, and no childhood friends encouraging them to seek higher office. A mercenary from Germany or Scandinavia couldn't even pronounce half the names in Byzantine politics, let alone navigate the complex web of family alliances that made local conspiracies possible. Their ignorance was their greatest qualification. The solution crystallized in 988 when Basil II formalized the Varangian Guard in exchange for Vladimir's 6,000 Rus warriors. The emperor needed warriors who were simultaneously too foreign to understand Byzantine politics and too professional to be corrupted by local influences. They needed men who could swing an axe with devastating efficiency but couldn't spell Constantinople if their lives depended on it. The emperor's recruiters began looking north, toward lands where political sophistication meant knowing which end of an axe to hold, and where the concept of bureaucratic advancement involved becoming the village headman. They needed warriors who could protect the emperor from threats they were too foreign to become. This desperate search for trustworthy ignorance would lead them to professional raiders who had no idea they were about to stumble into the career opportunity of several lifetimes. The Rus warriors didn't set out to become imperial bodyguards. They literally stumbled into the job while trying to get rich quick through what amounted to medieval venture capitalism. These northern traders and raiders were following rivers south through Russia, initially seeking new markets and anything valuable that wasn't nailed down. It was basically a business trip with axes, except the business model involved equal parts commerce and creative property redistribution. The route they chose was the Dnieper River system, which connected the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea like a watery highway through Eastern Europe. This seemed like a brilliant idea until they actually tried it. The journey involved navigating hostile tribes who considered Vikings uninvited dinner guests, treacherous rapids that could turn a longship into expensive kindling, and the Dnieper Cataracts, a series of waterfalls that made river travel about as practical as ice skating uphill. Between river systems, they faced the charming task of dragging their longships overland while carrying tons of cargo. Picture bearded warriors hauling 30-foot boats across muddy terrain while dodging bandits. The cargo they carried wasn't just random plunder. They were chasing dirhams, silver coins minted by the Abbasid Caliphate that had become the medieval equivalent of cryptocurrency, valuable, portable, and accepted everywhere that mattered. These coins appeared in trading posts around Lake Ladoga and the Baltic, creating a silver rush that drew Vikings south like moths to a very expensive flame. In 988, Vladimir I of Kiev sent 6,000 Rus warriors to Basil II, men who later formed the nucleus of the Varangian Guard. But their first glimpse of Constantinople changed everything. After months of dragging boats through wilderness and dodging arrows from locals who preferred their rivers, Viking-free, they crested a hill and saw the city rising from the horizon. The massive walls stretched for miles, punctuated by towers that looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought regular fortifications were for peasants. Golden domes caught the sunlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes that could be seen from impossible distances. For warriors accustomed to wooden halls and thatched roofs, Constantinople was like discovering that someone had built a city out of treasure. The Hagia Sophia alone contained more gold than most Vikings had seen in their combined lifetimes. Every surface seemed to gleam with precious metals. Every building looked like it had been constructed by people who considered marble a basic building material and treated silk like everyday fabric. The culture shock was immediate and comprehensive. These northern warriors, whose idea of urban planning involved placing the mead hall within stumbling distance of the sleeping quarters, were confronting a metropolis that housed more people than they'd ever imagined could exist in one place. The city's walls alone were taller than most Viking settlements, and the population was larger than entire kingdoms back home. They quickly realized this place contained more wealth than all their previous raids combined. Every monastery they'd ever pillaged, every merchant ship they'd ever captured, every village they'd ever liberated from its valuables. It all paled in comparison to what they were seeing. Constantinople wasn't just rich. It was obscenely, impossibly, almost insultingly wealthy. What started as a trading expedition became a career counseling session. The emperor, it turned out, paid better than pillaging. The mathematics were simple. Raiding was seasonal work with uncertain returns and high occupational hazards, while imperial service offered steady employment with excellent benefits. Word spread north through the Viking community faster than gossip at a village feast. The city that had once been a target became a destination, and the warriors who had once threatened its walls discovered they needed to convince Byzantine officials they deserved the privilege of protecting all that gold. The application process itself defied all logic. Imagine explaining to your Viking buddies that you're giving up raiding to become a palace guard, the medieval equivalent of trading your motorcycle for a security uniform. Picture that conversation around the mead hall. So Bjorn, what are your plans for next season? Well, I'm thinking of protecting wealth instead of stealing it. The silence would be deafening, followed by someone checking if you'd taken too many axe blows to the head. Byzantine officials faced the delicate task of determining whether former enemies could be trusted with the emperor's life. This wasn't like hiring a gardener or a scribe. This was asking professional raiders to become professional protectors, which required a complete reversal of their established skill set. Combat demonstrations formed the practical heart of the evaluation. Recruiters watched Norsemen wield the broad Dane axe, so feared it was called a romfia in some chronicles, then asked them to frame it as a palace accessory. Officials watched these warriors swing 6-foot axes with deadly precision, then somehow convinced themselves these same men would use those axes defensively. The logic was sound if you didn't think about it too hard. Weapon inspections followed, with Byzantine officials carefully examining each warrior's arsenal like they were appraising antiques. They checked the quality and condition of swords, axes, and shields, ensuring everything met imperial standards. This must have been surreal. Byzantine bureaucrats handling weapons that had probably been used against Byzantine soldiers just months earlier, nodding approvingly at their craftsmanship. The loyalty oaths presented their own complications. Most Varangians spoke little Greek and often communicated through a single interpreter, as suggested by runic graffiti later carved in Hagia Sophia itself. Vikings had to swear allegiance to an emperor they couldn't pronounce the name of, in a language they barely understood, for reasons that made no sense according to their cultural background. The single interpreter worked overtime, trying to explain Byzantine military hierarchy to warriors whose previous organizational experience involved deciding who got to loot which village first. Language barriers turned simple conversations into elaborate guessing games. "You'll be serving in the imperial palace," translated roughly to "you'll be standing around a very big house," while ceremonial duties became "you'll wear fancy clothes and try not to break anything expensive." The cultural translation was even more challenging than the linguistic one. The Vikings' initial confusion was perfectly understandable. They struggled to grasp why anyone would choose to protect wealth rather than acquire it through more direct methods. Their entire economic system was based on the principle that other people's possessions were merely unclaimed property waiting for proper Viking attention. Now they were being asked to prevent exactly the kind of creative redistribution that had made their careers possible. Successful candidates gradually realized they'd signed up for the most restrictive job of their professional lives. Gone were the days of flexible scheduling, creative problem-solving, and keeping whatever you could carry. Imperial service meant strict rules, constant duty, ceremonial police duties, and guarding the emperor's private prisons like the Numera, a lifestyle that bore no resemblance to their previous career in independent wealth acquisition. The final irony was that the empire's most feared enemies became its most devoted protectors, bound by oaths stronger than blood. Men who had spent their lives perfecting the art of breaking into places like the Byzantine palace were now professionally committed to keeping other people from doing exactly that. The transformation was complete when these warriors discovered that imperial service came with compensation that would change everything about how they understood wealth itself. The compensation package revealed the true genius of Byzantine recruitment strategy. These warriors became the highest-paid mercenaries in imperial service, receiving regular wages that exceeded anything seasonal raiding could provide, plus frequent gifts from the emperor in silk and precious gems. Instead of seasonal pillaging, they received a steady stream of gold coins. No more winter worries. The emperor distributed bonuses like a wealthy uncle at Christmas, except Christmas happened whenever he felt generous, and the gifts were measured in precious metals rather than knitted socks. Regular imperial gifts included silk robes worth more than most Vikings had seen in their combined lifetimes, gemstones that caught light like captured stars, and gold coins stamped with the emperor's face, currency that was accepted everywhere that mattered. Compare this to the feast or famine economics of traditional Viking employment. Raiding offered uncertain returns dependent on weather, enemy resistance, and whether someone had already looted your target destination. You might spend months preparing for an expedition only to discover that another crew had beaten you to the monastery and left nothing but disappointed monks and broken furniture. Imperial service eliminated these occupational hazards while providing something Vikings had never experienced: financial security without the need to split someone's skull for it. No more calculating whether the potential profit from attacking a fortified town justified the medical costs of the inevitable injuries. No more wondering whether this season's raids would cover winter expenses. The catch was that this steady income came with behavioral restrictions that would have horrified their raiding contemporaries. Gone were the days of flexible scheduling where you could decide to spend Tuesday afternoon liberating a merchant caravan from its valuables. Imperial service meant showing up on time, following orders from people who'd never held an axe, and maintaining professional standards that included not drinking yourself unconscious during working hours. Byzantine military protocol demanded instant obedience to commanders who might be half your age and had learned warfare from scrolls rather than experience. Vikings found themselves taking orders from people who thought tactics meant moving pieces around on a board rather than deciding which end of the enemy line looked easiest to break. Even spending their newfound wealth required imperial approval. The Guard had regulations about appropriate purchases, approved vendors, and acceptable behavior while representing imperial interests. Having money meant nothing if you couldn't spend it on the things that made money worth having in the first place. The privilege of palace pillaging provided additional motivation. On an emperor's death, Varangians had the right to rush the treasury and take all the gold they could carry, an incentive known in Old Norse as Plutusvarf. This unique benefit encouraged recruitment by combining steady employment with occasional opportunities for sanctioned looting, creating the perfect compromise between old Viking traditions and new Byzantine responsibilities. Despite the restrictions, Vikings accepted the arrangement because the mathematics were compelling. Byzantine gold transformed temporary raiders into permanent professionals, creating the medieval world's first truly disciplined mercenary force. The steady income allowed them to plan beyond their next meal, save money for retirement, and establish something resembling normal family lives. The golden handcuffs worked exactly as intended, binding these northern warriors to imperial service through financial incentive and professional pride. What they hadn't anticipated was how thoroughly unprepared they were for everything else that came with palace life. The daily realities of palace life created situations that no amount of battlefield experience could have prepared them for. Nothing prepared these northern warriors for the absurdity of being Vikings in the world's most sophisticated court. Imagine spending your career perfecting the art of kicking down doors, only to discover that your new workplace featured doors so ornate that damaging them would cost more than your village's annual income. The Byzantine palace wasn't just a building. It was a monument to the idea that everything could be made more complicated than necessary, then covered in gold to justify the complications. The architecture alone presented daily challenges that no amount of raiding experience could have anticipated. The guard barracks were likely housed in the Bucolian Palace, where narrow corridors forced warriors to remove their helmets just to navigate between rooms. Vikings found themselves turning sideways, ducking, and performing elaborate contortions just to move from one assignment to another. Every patrol became an exercise in spatial geometry, with warriors calculating angles like they were solving mathematical problems rather than providing security. Imperial protocol demanded mastery of ceremonial requirements that made military tactics seem straightforward by comparison. Vikings had to learn the specific procedures for imperial coronations, where the great palace's bronze doors tested whether their axe's width would even fit through the ceremonial entrances. They discovered that court etiquette had opinions about everything from walking speed to eye contact duration. Warriors who could read battlefield tactics at a glance found themselves stumped by the social complexity of determining whether to stand, sit, or kneel during various court proceedings. The language barriers transformed simple communications into elaborate guessing games that would have been hilarious if they weren't professionally important. Greek interpreters worked overtime trying to bridge the gap between Byzantine administrative terminology and Viking practical vocabulary. "Please escort the ambassador to the throne room," became a 20-minute conversation involving multiple hand gestures, several false starts, and at least one accidental reference to livestock. Vikings nodded politely while privately wondering if everyone had forgotten how to speak normally. Beyond ceremonial duties, the Varangians served practical functions that highlighted the palace's contradictions. They acted as jailers at the Numera prison, where the empire's most sophisticated court required Viking muscle to manage its most basic security needs. The irony wasn't lost on warriors who found themselves guarding Byzantine prisoners in the same palace, where they attended elaborate ceremonies celebrating imperial justice and divine authority. Their signature weapons became constant sources of logistical comedy. Dane axes designed for splitting shields and crushing armor proved awkward accessories in rooms filled with priceless artifacts and delicate decorations. Every movement required careful consideration. A casual gesture could demolish irreplaceable artwork, while turning too quickly might sweep precious objects off tables. Palace patrols resembled elaborate dances where heavily armed warriors tried to navigate spaces designed for unarmed diplomats. Byzantine officials gradually learned to accommodate their northern bodyguards' practical needs, while Vikings slowly adapted to their refined surroundings. The mutual adjustment process created a grudging respect between cultures that had nothing in common except professional necessity. This careful balance of accommodation and adaptation would face its greatest test when these practical warriors were required to participate in the empire's most sacred and formal occasions. Imperial ceremonies transformed into exercises in controlled chaos whenever the Varangian Guard participated. Picture the most solemn religious procession in Christendom, suddenly featuring a dozen bearded warriors carrying axes that could split a horse in half. The visual was striking in ways that Byzantine ceremony planners had never anticipated, like adding heavy metal instruments to a string quartet and hoping for the best. Coronations presented the ultimate test of Viking adaptability to imperial formality. These warriors stood guard, while emperors received crowns worth more than entire kingdoms, their presence both reassuring and terrifying to assembled dignitaries. The contrast was impossible to ignore: rough northern armor against backgrounds of gold, leaf, and precious stones. Practical weapons amid artworks that represented centuries of accumulated wealth. Vikings learned to remain motionless for hours, while surrounded by treasures that would have funded their entire previous careers. Church escorts created their own category of surreal spectacle. The emperor's journey to Hagia Sophia became a procession where Norse warriors flanked the most powerful man in Christendom, through streets lined with silk banners and incense burners. The irony was delicious. Former church raiders now protecting the head of Eastern Christianity as he traveled to worship in the most magnificent cathedral they'd ever seen. Some Vikings left their mark literally, carving graffiti into Hagia Sophia's marble railings, creating permanent evidence of their presence in this sacred space. Protecting religious relics required Vikings to guard objects they couldn't fully comprehend but recognized as valuable beyond measure. These northern warriors found themselves responsible for fragments of the true cross, pieces of saints' clothing, and artifacts that attracted pilgrims from across the known world. Their job was protecting things that people believed could perform miracles, which must have seemed like the strangest security assignment imaginable to men whose previous religious experience involved asking Thor for favorable winds. The nervous energy of Byzantine officials trying to choreograph ceremonies around unpredictable northern warriors was palpable during every major event. Court organizers developed contingency plans for Viking-related mishaps, backup routes if a warrior's axe got stuck in a doorframe, alternative seating arrangements if their armor proved too bulky for assigned positions, and diplomatic explanations for any cultural misunderstandings that might offend foreign dignitaries. The moments when Viking practicality clashed most dramatically with imperial formality became legendary among palace staff. Warriors instinctively scanned crowds for threats during peaceful ceremonies, their combat-trained eyes searching for danger that didn't exist. They struggled with the concept of ceremonial weapons, repeatedly asking why they couldn't bring their real axes to events where they might actually need them. Anna Komnene noted that the Varangians regarded loyalty to emperors and protection of their persons as a family tradition, a kind of sacred trust. This devotion wasn't to individual rulers, but to the imperial office itself. When Emperor Nikephoros II was assassinated, The guards immediately knelt before his murderer, John Zimisces, and hailed him as emperor, demonstrating their pragmatic understanding that their loyalty served imperial stability rather than personal relationships. The surprising effectiveness of this combination emerged from the Vikings' genuine devotion, adding authenticity to imperial grandeur. Their presence transformed ceremonial occasions from mere pageantry into demonstrations of real power backed by real consequences. Foreign ambassadors understood that Byzantine wealth was protected by warriors who knew exactly how to use their weapons, even if those weapons looked somewhat out of place among the silk tapestries and golden chalices. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 triggered the first major transformation in the Guard's composition. William the Conqueror's victory created a refugee crisis of displaced Anglo-Saxons and Danes, who suddenly found themselves unemployed in their own homeland. Over 5,000 of these warriors, according to some sources, looked south toward Constantinople, where steady imperial employment beckoned like a medieval unemployment office with better benefits. The influx of Anglo-Saxon recruits gradually replaced the original Norse warriors, transforming the Guard's ethnic composition from Scandinavian to English. It was like watching your favorite local restaurant slowly change its menu until you no longer recognize the cuisine. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 delivered a devastating blow that exposed the limits of even the most elite protection. The empire's crushing defeat at the hands of Seljuk Turks saw virtually all imperial guards fall defending Emperor Romanos IV, who was captured despite their sacrifice. It's difficult to maintain your reputation as elite bodyguards when the person you're supposed to protect gets captured after your entire unit dies trying to save him. The subsequent political instability made their role increasingly precarious, like security guards working for a company that kept changing management every few months. Military technology evolved beyond the Vikings' traditional strengths, rendering their signature combat style increasingly obsolete. The rise of crossbows, heavy cavalry, and sophisticated siege engines made individual warrior prowess less decisive in battle. Dane axes, designed for splitting shields, became less relevant when warfare shifted toward coordinated formations and ranged weapons. The Guard found themselves caught between their established fighting methods and a military world that no longer valued their particular skill set. The Christianization of Scandinavia eliminated much of the Guard's recruitment pipeline by transforming the very culture that had produced these warriors. As Norse societies converted to Christianity and developed more centralized kingdoms, fewer young men pursued careers in foreign military service. The traditional Viking culture that had created the Varangian Guard was disappearing, replaced by settled Christian communities that preferred agricultural pursuits to axe-wielding adventures in distant lands. Changing trade routes further reduced contact between Scandinavia and Constantinople, making recruitment even more difficult. The river systems that had carried Vikings south became less important as maritime trade shifted to other regions. The Golden Highway that had brought waves of northern warriors to Byzantine shores gradually fell into disuse, cutting off the cultural connection that had sustained the Guard for centuries. The Fourth Crusade's assault on Constantinople in 1204 struck the killing blow to the institution's military significance. During the siege, the Guard fought valiantly defending the city walls against the Crusaders. But when the defenses were breached and the Byzantine forces collapsed, they faced an impossible situation. With no legitimate emperor to defend, the Varangians found themselves without purpose. By the late 13th century, the Varangian Guard had become mostly ethnically assimilated into Greeks, but remained as corporate bodyguards until at least 1259, providing escort duties after battles like Pelagonia. Their primary function had transformed from elite fighting force into ceremonial palace decoration, standing around looking impressive during court functions rather than actually protecting anyone from real threats. The final curtain fell with Constantinople's collapse to the Ottoman Sultanate in 1453, ending an institution that had survived for centuries by adapting to changing circumstances. What had begun as an unlikely cultural collision was about to reveal something profound about the nature of historical adaptation itself. The Varangian Guard proves that history's most fascinating stories happen when cultures collide in ways no one could have predicted. Who would have thought that the solution to Byzantine paranoia involved hiring the very people they'd spent centuries trying to keep out? It's like solving your home security problem by recruiting the burglars who know your house best. This unlikely partnership reveals the remarkable adaptability of both civilizations. Vikings transformed from seasonal raiders into professional soldiers, discovering that steady employment beat the uncertainty of pillaging economics. Byzantines learned that sometimes the best protection comes from warriors too foreign to understand your politics and too well paid to care about your conspiracies. The Guard story reminds us that effective solutions often emerge from unexpected sources. When conventional wisdom fails, sometimes you need unconventional warriors. The Empire's most feared enemies became its most devoted protectors, bound by oaths stronger than blood and motivated by gold heavier than honor. History teaches us that cultural exchange works both ways. Vikings gained wealth and purpose, while Byzantines gained security and spectacle. Both cultures were changed by the encounter, proving that even the most unlikely partnerships can create something neither side imagined possible when they started swinging axes at each other.